and epics. In today's session, what we'll do is bring the discussion back to the fundamentals of Agile practice, and we often, those who are practitioners, run into this challenge that while the process is appearing to be running well, we get asked these questions by the business stakeholders, some very fundamental questions about how long will this effort take, and by the way, how much it's going to cost so I can budget appropriately upfront, and by the way, when do I get this particular feature which my client is waiting for, and questions of that nature. So we'll bring the discussion back on fundamentals and discuss how epics and stories and ambiguity in the process really helps answer these questions in a way that makes sense in real business situations. And I'm delighted to have Gary McCants as our presenter today. Gary is a 25-year veteran of software industry. He's experienced Scrum Master and has a great deal of strength in product, project, and requirements management side of the business of software. He's passionate about forming and nurturing high-performance teams and has found Agile methods to be a great way to achieve that, to accomplish his passion. Currently, he is a principal consultant with Improving Enterprises, where he fills the role of an Agile coach and mentor, which allows him to actually leverage his skills and passion, training and developing teams and helping them with Agile adoption. With that, over to you. Actually, before I do that, let me remind the folks of the basic structure for, we'll go through the 45 minutes of Gary's presentation, all of you, and then you are welcome to ask questions along the way. If you have any burning questions, then we'll definitely welcome those. But otherwise, we'll take all the questions towards the end. We'll leave 10-15 minutes towards the end to take all the questions at that point. With that, over to you, Gary.
Thank you very much, and welcome everybody. I'd like to thank CenterZip for the chance to present to you all today. So to get your lunch off started good, we have to start with a cartoon. I know that in my career I've had opportunity to meet people that would ask questions of me in this regard. I always get a chuckle out of how Dilbert seems to really nail it on the head. During our presentation today, I'd like you to watch out for road sign slides that have this little road sign in the corner. Along the way, we're going to run into some topics that are very important, and they are related to the session today, but we're not going to have the time to really delve into them. So these roadside slides will allow us to briefly consider the topics, but we'll stay on track with our message, and if the time permits, we can revisit those topics at the end during our question and answer period. So let's jump right into what it is we're actually looking for. So whenever you do planning, whether you're using an Agile method or you're using traditional methods, these are the types of questions that we need to ask and answer. How long is it going to take? When do I get my stuff? How much is it going to cost? And then for teams, how much can I do in a given iteration? Now watch this next slide. It's kind of busy. Scrum itself is represented on this single page, and Scrum has a number of answers for those questions. So briefly, I'd like to remind folks, if those of you who have seen and are practitioners of Scrum, all these things should be familiar. If this is the first time you've considered Scrum, let me point out a couple of things. Scrum is an iterative process represented sort of by this wheel in the middle, so it uses short cycles. It is bookended by a couple of events. We spend a day in planning at the very front. We spend a day at the end of a sprint to demonstrate what we've accomplished in that sprint, and we use about half a day to really reflect on things. Probably the most famous piece of Scrum is up here, this daily stand-up. So every day we take calls and the team gets together and really catches each other up on where we stand. And there's a number of other things that's on this slide, but Scrum is an Agile method that's probably the most popular out there today. And it does provide us with a number of components that allow us to answer those key questions. We're going to look at those today. Starting with the product backlog. The product backlog is that list of goals and features, requirements, et cetera, that a product must provide in order to meet its objective, meet its business needs. It is predominantly the realm of the product owner to create and maintain this list, and it is from this list that our teams are going to derive all of their work for all of their sprints. In addition to that component that's provided for in Scrum, there's this concept of velocity. Velocity is really just a word that we give for the measure of how much of the product backlog a team can handle in a given sprint. And in passing, it just has the characteristics of starting out low, as teams are kind of new, and rising and falling, but usually continually rising until it levels off. And this is a quantity, a measurement, if you will, that's observed. We don't speculate on this thing, except for your very first sprints in a brand new team. So if you take those two pieces, those two components, we have a product backlog and we have a velocity. And if you can kind of express it this way, if I have the product backlog telling me the total features that I need to do, and I can divide that by how many features I can do in time, which is our velocity, and then I multiply that by the sprint length. If I were to fill out that equation with that data, then what would I get? Well, I would get how long it took. And also, I would be able to have the data that allows me to produce something we call the release plan, which we'll see again. But it is this artifact, which is a visualization of the product backlog that allows us to answer so many of the questions that we started off the session with. So let's spend a moment talking about what these things really are, this product backlog. What is it populated with? I've said it's a list of features and so on and so forth. It could simply be that. It might just be simple statements of I need it to do this and I need it to do that. It could be use cases, our old standard standby use cases that have been around forever and ever. But more often than not nowadays, practitioners are using user stories to populate their product backlog. Now these user stories are really just simple statements that tag or represent our requirements and our customers' wants and needs. The user stories are not meant to be the requirements themselves. Think of it as the relationship of a user story to a requirement is like a picture of a boat is to the boat itself. They have a very simple format. As a role, I can do something so that I can accomplish something. Here's an example that I like to use fairly often as a theater patron. I can reserve a seat online so that I can go to the play. So these are simple statements. They are not meant to be the detailed requirements themselves, but notice that there's some powerful pieces of information available to you in this very simple format. With just this, you know who I'm talking about, a theater patron. You know the feature or the functionality that that actor wants to utilize, in this case reserving a seat online. And probably the most important piece of them all as we're doing requirements analysis, we know why. So we get that goal statement or that satisfaction statement right there at the end. This list is a model that was created by a gentleman named Bill Wake back in about 1995 or so. Bill was one of the guys that joined with Ron Jeffries and Kent Beck and the guys to create extreme programming. This INVEST model, they call it, is a nice way to remember what are the characteristics that we're looking for in good stories. So I'll briefly run through them right quick. Independent is that characteristic of one story is relatively as independent of one of another as possible. Independence is important because we would like to be able to have some freedom in how we prioritize these features. Negotiable refers to the idea that the story is written in a way that the team and the product owner can actually negotiate how to satisfy it. This characteristic of a story is important because even though stories are pretty easy to conceive, there is a little skill and art, if you will, to being able to write them, a story that's written in a way that there's no way for a team to use its imagination or its creativity is not a good story. For example, you have a story that says, as a developer, I can create a database that stores patron name. Well, that story isn't all that negotiable. It's already talking about databases, and next thing you know, the product owner and the business folks are sort of getting into the business of the development team. So we like stories to remain at the who, what, and why, and not get into the how, and that's the heart of the negotiability of a good story. Valuable seems pretty self-evident, but I'm sure if you've been in software for a while, you've seen requirements that you scratch your head and say, well, what in the world is that good for? So a good story should tag a feature or a requirement that is valuable to the business. Now, there is some debate around how we can quantify value. I think it's, for me at least, it's been exceedingly hard to come up with a very repeatable way to express actual business value. But there are a number of different models out there that have varying degrees of applicability. But at the end of the day, we do just want to be able to look at a story and, in cooperation with our product owner, discern that there is some value to satisfying that for our act. Estimatable simply means that the story is describing or tagging something that the team has some hope of being able to estimate. Certainly that's important to our topic today. But you can imagine that there are ways to tag requirements that don't allow you any real room to get a handle on estimating it. And sometimes, I'm sure you've run into a requirement might drive a team into completely unknown territory. So they have no experience at all with the technology or with that particular domain. And it requires there to be some work done to allow them to be able to estimate it. But at the end of the day, we need to be able to estimate it. Testable refers to some way to confirm that we have satisfied that story in the eyes of the product owner. This is somewhat self-evident by the feature and the why, but there is a lot more that you can do to accoutre a story to make it more testable. And no, I didn't skip small. I just wanted to talk specifically about small because that's at the heart of what we're trying to accomplish today. So,
hey Gary, let's take one question which is directly at this topic just come up. Can I inject that in here?
Certainly.
The question is, what if the features that you're planning for don't quite fit the invest model that you're going through, which is, it means, for example, they may be small but not independent, or they may be small but not valuable, or independent but not small, any of those combinations. So, which is not uncommon in certain situations. So, if your stories don't fit, don't qualify on all the counts, what do you do?
Well, I would just, I would close my notebook and walk out of the room myself. No, I'm just kidding. So this list is, think of it as that checklist for an ideal story. You're certainly, and that's a great question, you're certainly going to run into stories that are, could be written better. And I spend a disproportionate amount of my coaching time with product owners. I have a little bit of a soft spot for them, I guess. This expressing the business's needs in story form does take some experience and some skill, and it's the rare individual that can understand the format and then immediately start writing stories that perfectly fit the invest model. So the best answer I have is certainly don't just reject a story that might fail one of these criteria, and if you want a tagline for a story, according to Ron Jeffries, the one that really actually came up with the whole idea, it's just a reminder to have a conversation. So certainly, if a practitioner is looking at this invest model and they're comparing a story, a candidate story against it, and they see, I can't discern any value out of this story, or this story is so intimately coupled and tied to this other story and has no independence. Think of those as opportunities to have a conversation with your product owner about those very things, and it might lead to a better understanding of what the story is really trying to represent and it'll help both the understanding of the practitioner as well as the product owner themselves. So bottom line, don't reject a story just because it fails one of these tests. Use these things to discern, am I working with a story that is as near ideal as possible? And if it isn't, those are opportunities to have discussions.
Great, thanks.
You bet. So back to small for a second. So not all stories are created equal. So the one that I've sort of started us with is, as a theater patron, I can reserve a seat online so that I'm sure I can go to the play, actually represents quite a bit of functionality. That's a pretty big chunk of work. Figuratively, in my little blocks, as you might see over there in different sizes, it's one of those, could be one of those bigger blocks. But this story could be broken down a little bit. It could be, the functionality could be decomposed, if you will, into sort of more bite-sized pieces. So I made up a couple here. As a theater patron, I can choose a seat from a seat map so that I can sit where I want. And as a theater patron, I can pay for my chosen seats so that I can complete my reservation. So both of these stories are sort of along the way of reserving a seat so you can go to the play, but they're a little more bite-sized. So again, figuratively, they might be a little bit smaller, represented more by these lime kind of blocks. And staying on the idea of small, these lime kind of blocks, these smaller ones, ideally could fit into a single sprint, and that's my best definition for what small really means, is that a story is broken down of sufficient size to be able to be completely satisfied in a single sprint. Okay, so what about the rest of the invest model? So if we consider again that theater patron story about reserving a seat online, and if you'll acknowledge, yeah, that's kind of big. Well, it is still negotiable. It is certainly still valuable, and I'm pretty sure that a team that spends a little time with product owner and a little bit in the domain can estimate this particular story, especially if I'm estimating it relative to the other things in the product backlog. And I can certainly come up with a set of tests or describe some conditions of satisfaction around the story, even though it is kind of a big, epic kind of story. But these epic stories are often not independent, and by definition, they are not small. An epic story, as you've seen, can couple a number of things together. So it's occasionally you will run into an epic story that would fail the independent mark. And if it's a small story, well, it's a violation of the whole idea of an epic story. But given all that, an epic story is very key in knowing something important, specifically how much is there. So the product backlog, when it is filled with things like user stories, it does give us a nice list, but we need something a little bit weightier. We need to be able to get our hands on it a little bit more. So ideally, we'd love to be able to put some sort of sizes or weights or something that will obey arithmetic on these stories. And if we could do that and we could sum all of that together, then we could come up with a total. And that total is important not only for just figuratively knowing how much work's there, but it's what plugs into that, that equation that I mentioned to you earlier, becomes the numerator about the total features in our backlog. And that's a very important piece for us being able to fill out the equation that's there. The other thing that it allows us to do is it becomes the destination for our release burn-up. It becomes that the place that we're going, and it allows us to be able to create artifacts such as the release plan that will enable us to answer the questions of how long is it going to take versus when am I going to get a certain thing. So a little bit about this graph if you've never seen it before. in this particular case, it's a graphical representation of that figurative backlog that we had of 180 story points. In this particular case, our team has discerned that it's going to take 10 sprints to do it. Now, if you think about it quickly, you could probably figure out what velocity they're using to arrive at that. The green line represents the ideal slope, starting from we haven't done anything to we're complete. And it sets sort of a reference along the way of here's where you should be if you're doing decent velocity and it's repeatable and you're homogeneous over all those sprints. That's where you ought to be. The blue line, well, the blue line represents where you actually are. And it is that blue line that makes this particular chart so valuable. We probably have some folks in the audience that have done Gantt charts and PERT charts and some of the traditional milestone graphs and et cetera that our earlier methods called out for. I have too. I've been a project manager in the fields for quite a bit of my career. The one thing that is so powerful about this particular chart is that it improves sprint after sprint after sprint. And it's improving not based on better speculation or someone giving me better estimates. It's improving based on the observed behavior and performance of the team, as well as the continually refined product backlog as the product owner is continuing to add and detract features, break things down. So the sizing improves over time, and we're able to observe the team's performance over time, their velocity. So this particular chart is better in Sprint 4 than it was in Sprint 3. And once a business owner, once a customer really understands that this particular graph starts out really no better than the traditional charts, but it gets better and better over time, then they really start to love these sorts of charts. And that 180 that's up there is very important for us to be able to create this.
Gary, can we take one more question, which is?
You betcha.
The question is there any kind of, I would call it, rule of thumb that you would advise for how many stories should be expected to be handled in one sprint of a typical team, let's say 4 to 6-person Agile team? How many stories per sprint?
Yeah, there's really no way to predict that, but I will tell you what I have observed. Most teams are pulling somewhere between 3 to 5 stories a sprint. Now, I do have to be careful with that question. One's performance has no relationship at all to your team's performance. Y'all are going to size things differently. Your environment's different. The skills of the team could be very different. But it seems like over the years, teams have sized things in such a way, and they've chosen sprint lengths in such a way, and the environment has restricted them in such a way that I'm seeing sprint backlogs that are populated with somewhere between 3 to 5 stories. Now, the corollary to that question is, what's the average velocity over the industry? Well, there's no such a thing. In fact, that's one of the big departures from this type of modeling of requirements and modeling of performance than our traditional ways, where I can remember back in the day we would see the IEEE publish, well, this is how many average lines of code someone could create, or this is how long a particular thing should take based on function points. And they're trying to use some heuristics or measurements across this wide band of projects. For good reason. They wanted some predictability, but we've pretty much decided over those years that you can't commute that data. You can't really use that data from place to place. So Agile in general, Scrum in specific, rejects the idea of really trying to look at someone else's work to be able to predict your own. What it offers instead is what I just mentioned earlier, a process and a set of artifacts that tell you exactly what's going on for this team and this project that gets better over time. And if that feels like a give up, consider this for a second. If you can get a project underway using Scrum, in 2 to 4 weeks, you've got data that lets you refine your plan. If you use traditional methods, you can burn 2 to 4 weeks just trying to get sign-offs for traditional use cases or documents. So which is more valuable to your customer? Data that's actually going to improve your ability to forecast, or more sign-offs? So.
Great, thanks.
Okay. So this next slide, this is my golden slide for kind of pausing for a second. I'm covering a number of very important topics, but I'm leaving on the sideline a lot of questions. So my roadside slide here is a chance for me to pause for just a second and say a little bit about some of the questions that may be in your head. So, for example, these numbers that you're talking about, Gary, what do they actually represent? And how do I arrive at those things? Well, user stories can be sized. These numbers can represent hours and days, but I don't have any teams, in fact, and I know none of my peers recommend using hours or days. Everyone's using story points or something equivalent. Story points are very popular because they allow the team to estimate the size of these stories relative to another story inside of that same backlog. So that we're not trying to measure a story based on somebody else's work, very salient to the earlier question. We're just trying to get an understanding of, within this particular set of stories, is this one larger or smaller, and by what degree to this other one. This allows us to avoid a number of things that skew our estimates in the past. For example, we don't have to guess about who's going to work on a particular story. If I'm using man hours or man days, well, it can make a lot of difference if someone that's brand new to the team, fresh out of college, is doing it, or it's an old grizzled veteran like me that's been doing it for years. So who works on a story can directly affect how many hours or days, but it doesn't affect whether there's relative size differences between the two. So there are a number of things that we can avoid by staying with something that is not tied to time. And then with respect to how do we assign these numbers, planning poker has been around since the early 90s. It was another thing that came out of the extreme programming guys. They called it the planning game. It is a very popular way to assign the sizes through spawning discussions. It's a very simple approach, and there are a number of variations that can be used, but it is a means for us to be able to discern what kind of sizes to put on these things.
Gary,
so
let's take one more question
okay.
Again, since it is pertinent on this particular page, and we'll minimize some confusion some audience members may have. The question is, I have seen story points representing value rather than complexity/effort. How do people do this? So it sounds like there are some people who seem to think these are value. So can you comment on that?
Well, story points were intended to be an indication of the size of a story, and the sizes usually includes things, mostly the level of effort. I often coach teams to consider risk. You potentially could use value. I've got to think about that for a second. I've never seen that done. I'm not sure what that's really telling me, because the value, while it is very important in the prioritization decisions that a product owner needs to use, it seems a little incongruent with the idea of how much effort or how much risk is involved in turning that requirement into product. So I'd have to explore a little bit the reasoning with the people that wanted to use story points to indicate some level of value. And I would ask them, if the story points indicate value, then what indicates effort and risk and the size of it?
So let me add, Gary, one thing here I have seen in our work, and I think another audience member is probably adding the same thing. The story points clearly, as Gary, as you're covering, clearly the effort estimate, and that makes sense. But there's a parallel school of thought which says to prioritize user stories, you could conceivably think of a similar notion of a value point, where you, along the story, a product owner provides some value points, and that allows you to also prioritize and know which is a more valuable story, therefore.
Certainly, and I support that idea a lot. I remember earlier when we were looking at the invest model, I described that I've found it difficult to come up with a repeatable, kind of predictable measure of valuable. There are a number of different approaches out there that can work. I'm thinking of the Pareto type of things, or Kano analysis, Monte Carlo simulations. There's a number of things out there. But honestly, most of the customers I work with don't have a science or a calculus available to them to be able to truly apportion value to stories. And think of it this way, especially when we're working with the smaller stories, kind of at the top of the list, or lime-colored blocks. You know, these may be very small pieces of functionality to fit into a sprint. My favorite example is like a log-on story. So, you know, pretty much every system has to authenticate at least who's using it. Well, how much business value is there in that? You know, it's kind of hard to say, well, that's worth about $200 a day, I guess. So some of these stories, as we get them smaller in bite size, it becomes more and more difficult to be able to assign an actual scalar number that represents value. Frankly, what I see in the field most often, and it's worked okay, is a product owner that is in tune with their business and has a vision for the product, has a sense of priority based on the features that are represented by the stories, almost intrinsically. They will look at it and say, I want that more than I want this other one. It's when they see the effort involved with them that they can make better decisions on some of the prioritizations. So there may be a feature, for example, that they really, really like, and the team sizes it, and it's big, it's a 40. And then there's one right behind it that's almost as valuable to the product owner, and it's a 5. It's simple. Well, that's all the data that the product owner needs to say, I guess, tell you what, I'll switch those priorities. So bottom lining it, I certainly don't have any problem with the notion of a business value indicator, value points or something along those lines. And if someone can figure out a way to bottle that up, I'll buy a case, because I've been searching for a simple way to coach product owners of how to accrue value.
I think we should keep this as a topic for another webinar. This is a good topic.
I think that is a good one too. All righty. Well, let's return to our epics for a second. So we've established that epics are useful in building our product backlog, but they're really not small enough to fit into a single sprint. So one might ask, well, let's just break them all down, right? Let's make everything small. And my answer to that is, ouch. There's a cost that's involved with taking something from epic to small, and it is predominantly time. There's a number of different time sinks that come to play here. First off, the time from the product owner themselves to sit and take an epic story that in a single card, if you will, represents a large piece of functionality, and then break that down into its individual little bite-sized components. That's a lot of mental energy, and it's a lot of time for the product owner and their support staff. The second place, it takes a lot of time of the team themselves, especially if the team is already in a sprint. If the team has made a commitment in a sprint and we're underway, and we do want them to be the ones that size the stories because they are the ones going to do the work, then we have to steal time away from the team to break those epics down and size those epics. And sometimes that can really knock a team off of its wheels. The third area where time can really be disadvantageous to you is when you're first starting off. So there is there's some comfort to a business or a stakeholder or a product owner to say, wow, I'm going to break all these things down very finely, and I'm going to build a very precise and detailed plan. But Scrum itself is an empirical process. It's an inspect and adapt sort of process. It needs to get into motion for us to start to generate data that'll help us build better forecasts, give the team some idea of what their velocity really is. So there's a balance between the time you invest in starting projects, Agile projects off, between how much do I spend breaking down stories very finely in my product backlog versus allowing epics to reside and represent work that's going to come up later. So it's a big time investment, mental energy investment to break these epics down into small. My dad has a saying that's kind of stuck with me. I'll share with you guys. So the idea of breaking an epic down into small, it's kind of like a dime holding up $1. I'm going to wait for everybody to quit laughing at that. So here's kind of the bottom line. Avoid breaking down every story to small because it does take away time from delivery, and frankly, you're probably wasting effort on the lower priority features. It's effort better used to get the team underway and start generating some data. Okay, so the epic story, in addition to all we've talked about so far, is also key to something else. Yeah, I think Santa's pretty epic too. So Santa's here to remind us that it is July, and you've probably started to see the advertisements about Christmas in July. But for those that practice Christmas or something equivalent, if you're like me, you create a Christmas list. And so I want you to just pause for a second and think about your Christmas list. Now for me, mine looks something like, all right, Becky, anything that's not cookware. Okay, and for Sean, I don't know, maybe something for his computer, and Bill, maybe some new football cleats or something like that. I don't have a Christmas list that has product codes in them. And I don't have the store that I'm necessarily going to go to, and even if I do have the store I'm going to go buy, I don't know what aisle it's in or shelf it's on. I don't know what clerk is going to satisfy my shopping need that day. I don't know what time I'm actually going to check out. So my Christmas list that has served me quite well for all these years doesn't have all this rich detail around how to satisfy those Christmas gifts. And that, to me, is a very telling indicator of a natural human state. I feel, and I believe it's true, that ambiguity is natural for us, and that ambiguity allows us to represent needs and wants in a way that's usable to us, but doesn't burden us down with a great deal of detail. Not only is it natural, but it supports some Agile principles. Specifically, it allows our Agile endeavors to get started sooner. It permits the management of a large amount of information. So those epics that we've been talking about that are in the middle and in below represent a lot of information in a very compact package. And borrowing from some lean principles that are out there, the idea of holding something at a healthy level of ambiguity allows us to delay some commitments until we have fresher information. Now this one is this one takes a minute for me to kind of explain. When you express something, a requirement in an ambiguous state, there are details that the team really needs. Well, if those are not written down, what options does a team have to be able to get that detail? Well, if you're following Agile values and principles, we would try to collaborate, and we'd rather collaborate than have a bunch of contracts. And we'd like to honor the idea, the principle, that business folks work with the teams daily. So these epic stories that are holding a large amount of information at a fairly high and natural level of ambiguity require us to talk about them when they become more important as they start moving up the priority list, if you will. So we talk about them to get the detail that we need that fosters the kind of collaboration It allows us to make decisions and commitments based on fresh information. It drives the whole breaking down into smaller stories. So really at the heart of it, these epic stories promote healthy ambiguity, and that whole mechanism, that engine of disambiguating things allows us to deliver the most important features sooner. Okay. So I would like to encourage everyone to embrace your epicness. If you are if you're a team member, or if you're a product owner, or if you're a business person, or you're just someone that's curious, these product backlogs, that list of features and values and needs from our customers, is best served with a mixture of sizes in them, where we're holding in abeyance for later discussion those items that are less valuable, lower priority, and we're really investing our time in ones that are the highest priority and breaking them down. The stories are there to help us remember to have the conversation, so we're not losing those requirements. They're not going to hide anywhere. And that healthy level of ambiguity that leads us to writing epics is going to allow us to have the kind of discussions we need at the right time. So don't invest all the time to try to make everything homogeneous and so that you have the same amount of precision for the feature you're going to see a year from now as you do in the feature that you're going to see in a week from now. Now, a little hook for a future session. We've been talking about the epics and how valuable they are, and we've alluded to you do want to break those things down smaller as we go. And you might be thinking, well, okay, how do I go about that? I think that's a great future session where we can take this whole concept and talk about the best practices, the timing, and some guidelines on how to break those epics down into the smaller stories. And my favorite quote from one of my favorite presidents. And at 12:43, I'm all done.
Excellent. Thank you, Gary.
You're quite welcome. Let me click a few buttons and turn it over to you, Hemant.
Okay. I should do that. Yeah, I'm able to do that, I think.
Okay.
Yes.
If you can rest control, and there you go.
Great. Thank you, Gary, for the excellent walkthrough of this topic. So, audience, now that you have heard this content from Gary, this is the time to reflect upon it and come up with questions. We already have, Gary, a few questions in here, but I'll let the audience come up with more questions. And in the meantime, while they're doing that, I'll get to a page to provide sinners of introduction here. And I'm assuming you guys are able to see. Gary, can you confirm you're able to see my screen now? I'm scrolling down to the right page that I need to see.
I can see your screen. What a great slideshow you've got.
Okay. Excellent. So this is the question screen. So while audience, you're putting your questions down in the panel, which I'll come back to in just a couple of minutes, I'll introduce Synerzip. So Synerzip, in a nutshell, we are a software product development and emphasis on partner for small to mid-sized technology companies. We help them essentially expand their engineering teams to handle more additional software development as they go through expansion phase and growth phase. Our typical clients tend to be venture-backed software companies. And all the work we do is the intellectual property of our clients, and we do complete life cycle of software development, right from requirements definition to testing and deployment. For each client, we put together a dedicated team of high caliber software professionals. We follow Agile, as you probably have already figured out by now. So, but we're not a staff augmentation company. We have full kind of a management support. Our teams function like an extension of a client's team, and very stable teams. That's very important. Because that's what is needed to deliver good quality software, as to have stability in the teams. And third point about us is our ability to reduce the delivery risk for our clients, given our experience in software development and our experience and abilities to be able to strike the right level of balance in discipline of software development versus being responsive and quick to our clients. That really helps our clients reduce their risk when they work with us. And the fourth point about us is our ability and value proposition to reduce the cost. We have a dual shore team. We have a team in the US here and also in India, and we are able to put together a team that really reduces the cost for our clients significantly to do development. And the last point is flexibility and control, essentially. We allow and facilitate almost for any of our clients to convert the team that is working at Synergy for them into their own captive team at any point they want. So that's Synergy in a nutshell. Next page just gives a glimpse of some of our clients. You may recognize some names. Most of them, almost all of them actually, are small to mid-sized technology companies spread around the nation, but with a strong bias towards Texas. So a number of Austin, Dallas, Houston companies here. So that's the quick overview about us. Let's come back to the questions now, and let me take the questions from the question Q&A panel here. So give me a minute to open my panels here. Okay. So are you ready, Gary, to take a few questions?
I'm ready. Hit me.
Okay. All right. Let's take the first question, which is, let me actually make sure I get the page back up here. Okay. So the first question is, we talked a little bit about stopping the urge to break stories, epics down to detailed stories upfront and not wasting that effort. But the question is, so how do you balance that need to have an upfront budget that a management or stakeholders need to make a go, no-go decision without, if you have not broken the stories, all the stories or epics down to an adequate level of detail to be able to provide adequate level of confidence in the estimation itself of for the project, whether it is a go, no-go, how do you even start?
That's a great question. So the epics are estimatable. You know, if we go back to that invest model, the only characteristics that epics are going to be challenged with are independence and the size of them. So a team can take a look at an epic and can size that epic relative to other stories within the backlog, knowing that it's going to be at the higher end of the scale. If you're using sort of the traditional estimating scale, it goes up to 20s and 40s and 100s, and so your epics are going to be, you know, in that area. But it all goes together in answering the question of how much work's actually there, and that is a very key component in being able to answering the questions of the business of go, no go. Now the question really becomes challenging if the people that are trying to make the decisions on go, no go demand high precision. So if you go back to that Dilbert cartoon, if someone shows up and they really can't tell you exactly everything that you need and tell you exactly what it's going to look like over the course of the development period, but then they demand an estimate that's down to, you know, the day or the week, that's frankly just unreasonable. And I honestly, I don't see it that much in organizations that are in good organizations. I think it's a really good thing that we've got governance, that we've got people that are making sure that we're working on the most important thing, and I expect them to ask questions of, you know, give me some kind of idea of how long this is going to take and how much it's going to cost. But we can answer those questions using these techniques and with epics in our product backlog and have a more defensible answer than you can with some of the traditional methods that we're making assumptions all over the place about the team and who was on the team and how much distraction they were going to have and all these other, it's like a house of cards. So to me, actually, it's a benefit to using epics to allow us to get a defensible answer of how much work's there. And then the rest of it is that pretty much that simple equation of how much can I do in a given sprint and how long is my sprint. I can tell you how long it's going to take then. And one of the other nice things that may not be self-evident is if you're following Scrum, it wants you to put a team together and it wants you to hold that team together. So we don't have a lot of revolving doors in Scrum areas. We want to keep that team together. And if you have a team of 7, 9 folks together, it's pretty straightforward to discern, to calculate how expensive is it to keep that team in the field operating in my project on a day or week basis? Every finance company director that I know of has a blended rate or a budgetary rate. You can discern how much it's costing on a per day, per week basis. So if you know how long and you know how much they cost to keep in the field, then you have a very defensible answer to the question, how much is it going to cost? So the epics, I think, are key to you being able to make a good decision on a go, no-go without spending months and months and months and months trying to get very precise requirements that really are not helping you with that decision.
Okay, let's take next question. I'm not sure I've entirely understood the question, but I'm going to read it out, and I think you'll. But I think I get the gist of what is being asked here. It says using epics, we get to nested stories, sometimes 3 levels of, I guess, nesting. So which gets complex. Any general advice on how to keep the context of the epic while building out more detailed stories where needed?
Okay, so nested is an interesting term. And I wish I could ask a question back to the person. There's 2 concepts in product backlogs with larger pieces. We spend a lot of time talking about an epic. An epic is really just a big old story. But there's another concept that isn't used as often and I think is just as powerful. It's the idea of a theme. So the person that asked the question, what you might be sensing is that people are writing epics when they really are trying to think thematically. So, for example, the story that I use, this reserve a seat online story, that truly is an epic. It's about just being able to do all of the functions necessary to be able to get a ticket and reserve the thing online. But thematically, there's some things that go along with being able to reserve. For example, you could imagine that there may be a story that says, as a theater patron, I can see all of the upcoming productions. As a theater patron, I can print my reservation out or print my ticket. So those are stories that don't directly decompose from being able to reserve the seat, but thematically they hold together, being able to see what productions are there so I can choose one to reserve a seat so that I can have a ticket that I can print, that sort of thing. So if what you're experiencing is, by nesting, is stories that are sort of tangentially related, then my advice would be to have a conversation with the product owner to say, is there a way for us to maybe not use this humongous epic to represent these related stories? Is there a way to think of it more thematically where we have maybe 3 epics, slightly smaller epics that represents it all, rather than just this one big super tanker? So I'm hoping that's what the question was about.
Right. Let's go to another one now, in this case. Actually, let me respond to one general question that are coming up here. So we will definitely make the slide deck available. You'll receive a follow-up email from me, I guess, tomorrow with a pointer to the slide deck, so you'll all have it. In terms of recording, we are recording this, but we're not sure the quality of recording is going to lend itself or not. So stay tuned. We'll let you know if the recording is such that it is worthwhile to make it available. With that, let's go back to the content questions. Another one is backlog grooming. Can you talk a little bit about how the backlog grooming fits in this model?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the Scrum view of the world identifies really just 3 roles: the product owner, the Scrum Master, and the team. The product owner, sometimes I see practitioners or companies that want to consider the product owner part of the Scrum team, and that's incorrect, frankly. I mean, everybody's part of the overall team. If you make the team big enough, then everybody's on it. But in the workings of a good application of Scrum, the product owner is distinct from the team, and they have their own duties. So we've said that the product backlog is their charge. They create it, they maintain it, and you hear the word grooming a lot. Grooming typically means types of activities that we've alluded to, breaking larger stories into smaller ones, prioritizing the product backlog so that the most important things rise to the top. In passing, I also mentioned that the testability of stories, there's some built in just with the way stories are written, but there's this whole area of acceptance criteria, and it's a very hot topic today, that you can adorn a user story with that provides the next level of detail for satisfaction. All of those adornments, all of those accoutrements to the product backlog and to the stories themselves rolls under this concept of grooming. And it is still the responsibility, technically, of the product owner to do that grooming. Some of it they can do by themselves or with their support staff. Some of it they need the team themselves. Specifically, the product owner cannot or should not try to size those stories themselves. They're not the ones doing the work. They need to be consumers of those sizes, those estimates. It's the team themselves that need to size the things. So the grooming part includes not only just the breaking down, adding acceptance criteria, reprioritization, but also the sometimes exhausting work of sizing those stories with the team themselves. And the tricky part, one of the hard parts to Scrum, is that product backlog grooming needs to be done in parallel with the actual development itself. So what I coach my product owners is I coach them to be at least a couple of sprints ahead, seek to be at least two or three sprints ahead of the team with respect to your backlog grooming, meaning that you've got enough stories that are of the right size, right priority, adorned with acceptance criteria, and been sized by the team so that when the next sprint planning day comes up, we don't have to stop down and catch up on all that. But the other side of the equation gets to what we talked about today. You don't want to spend so much time grooming the backlog into very finely grained stories for features that are way out there. Bottom of the list, won't be seen for months. So backlog grooming is extremely important. It's like your gasoline that you put in your engine. You've got to fill that tank up, and it needs to be done in parallel with the actual development itself.
Let's take a follow-up to the prioritization topic that you've talked a lot about, Gary. So is prioritization driven entirely by business value, or sometimes we've heard people talk about the delivery, the technical risk of a story that it has? Is that part of the prioritization also, or there's some other considerations like some dependencies and sequencing perhaps? So what drives, how do you come up with the prioritization?
Yeah, so that's a great question too. It is false that the prioritization is purely based on business value. I think that would be a very rose-colored glasses way of looking at the world. And those characteristics that you just mentioned, I think, are all applicable. The product owner is a tough role. I heard a famous practitioner recently say the primary job of the product owner is to maximize the ROI of development, meaning that they are continually prioritizing and doing all this grooming with the idea of trying to get the most value out of the team in any given sprint. So if their prioritization was purely based on the big bang, if you will, of the feature and did not take into account the effort or the risk or any of those other things, then it would be a pretty short-sighted way to prioritize. Now the basics, though, are pretty simple. When a particular feature is being considered for prioritization over its near neighbors, certainly one of the key things that a product owner needs to know is how long is it going to take, or what's the effort involved in bringing it into being. In the presentation I mentioned earlier that that feature that's the apple of the product owner's eye might be an epic feature, followed behind just next by one that's almost as good at a fraction of the cost, a fraction of the effort. Well, a good product owner is going to use those factors in prioritizing things. Now, there's one other piece to prioritization that I sort of alluded to it. Sometimes these sizes, sometimes these teams will size these stories taking into account the risk or the technical challenge that's there. And I think that's grand. I think that's really good. In fact, what I seek to coach and establish inside of healthy teams is a little bit of positive tension between the product owner and the team. I think it works for the benefit of the company and the clients and the customers themselves. If the product owner is attempting to pull a little bit more out of the team, egg them on and say, can you give me a little bit more? Well, at the same time, the team is pulling back to say, if I go any faster, then I'm going to generate tremendous technical debt. I'm going to generate a lot of code that I'm going to have to refactor. I'm going to produce something I'm not proud of and that's brittle. And so they're pulling back to say, no, not so fast. Don't be so feature-focused that I can't produce a good product. And so sometimes the prioritization can get affected. A team can look at a backlog and say to the product owner, well, we understand that this number 7 story here is not on the top of your list, but could we influence you or persuade you to allow us to bring that one forward because it is so technically challenging or we're so worried about it? If that conversation happens and it doesn't turn into a fist fight, then to me that's a really good sign that those practitioners are forming that positive tension and they're actually collaborating to try to get the work done.
Excellent, Gary. This is a great answer. I know we could go on and take on the next topic also, which is technical debt, that you planted the seed, but we have run into the barrier of time. So thank you so much for taking the time, Gary, for going through this, and all of you for attending today's webinar. We'll have another one. We'll skip next month because we have an in-person event with Agile Conference. Just a reminder to all of you, next month is the 10th anniversary Agile Conference in Salt Lake City. So many of us will be there, and so we'll skip the webinar for that month. We'll be back in September for another webinar on this Agile topic. Thank you all, and have a great rest of the summer.